Roanoke colony was one of the first European settlements in the United States. Located on an island off the coast of what is now the state of North Carolina, the colony was established in 1587 under the auspices of the first Queen Elizabeth. Soon after, the colony's leader, John White, returned to England, where the settlers came from. His trip was meant to be brief. He was only meant to grab supplies and return to the New World. But political upheaval, in the form of England's war with Spain, prevented White from returning until 1590. It was only 3 years, but a lot had changed when John White returned. In fact, the entire colony, consisting at the time of 115 people, including a newborn baby by the name of Virginia Dare, was gone, just up and vanished. All that was left was a post onto which the word Croatoan had been carved. Croatoan referred to the name of a native tribe that had been on good terms with the settlers. So White thought the colonists had moved to Croatoan Island, now known as Hatteras, North Carolina. But they had not. It remains one of the most famous disappearances that no one can explain. What's more, there's never been any evidence to suggest the colony was massacred. Many believe that baby Virginia grew into a beautiful young woman, one who eventually fell into a doomed love affair with a native warrior by the name of Okisco. To this day, she haunts the woods in search of her mane, often in the form of a diaphanous white deer, one that always vanishes at dawn. According to Encyclopedia, a state encyclopedia maintained by the North Carolina government and Heritage Library, longtime residents of the island have no doubt that the identity of the phantom deer is the ghost of Virginia Dare. If you're itching for an explanation as to how an entire colony could just disappear, that's not simply more ghost stories. You're not alone. On the positive side, it's one of a handful of mysteries that could be solved in the next decade. This true ghost story might strike you as more awe than eek, but only until you consider that we really have no idea what our four-legged friends can sense that we cannot, including the scariest of scary stories. Can dogs see ghosts? Well, there are plenty of dog experts out there, including veterinarians, who will attest to the fact that there's lots of documentation that could support the notion that dogs can sense paranormal activity, as Jesus Aramendi, DVM, a senior veterinarian for Chewy, put it. And then there's the fact that this story came to Reader's Digest directly from a well-known psychic medium, Christy Robinette, who has used her ghost-whispering skills to help detectives solve confounding cases. Marlene settled onto her side of the bed and patted Jack's pillow beside her, Robinette told Reader's Digest. A year had gone by, but Marlene was still adjusting to widowhood. Maybe it was crazy to think that, after 40 years of marriage, she would ever adjust. Elmer the golden retriever seemed to understand this from the very first. That cold, moonless night when Marlene returned alone from the hospital, Elmer did something he'd never done before. He jumped up onto Jack's side of the bed and lay his head on the pillow. Jack would never have allowed it, Robinette pointed out, but Marlene didn't shoo him off. Instead, she lay down beside Elmer and let the peaceful sound of his snoring lull her to sleep. The next night was the same, and the night after that. Over the past year, it had grown into a comforting routine, but not tonight. Tonight was the first time Elmer had left Marlene alone in the bed since Jack's passing. But hearing nails clicking on the wood floor downstairs, Marlene recognized the sound of Elmer requesting outsize. With a sigh, Marlene made her way down the stairs to the foyer. But Elmer wasn't pacing in front of the big oak door. Rather, he was dancing and wagging and wiggling and bowing, just like he used to do when Jack would come home from work. To Marlene, it felt as if Jack had just come home, and Robinette, who is known for her intuition about these things, believes that is indeed what happened. A few years ago, I moved into a one-bedroom apartment in Melbourne, Australia, they went on to recall. It was my first time living on my own. The apartment block had been built in the 1930s. I'd been there for a few months when I came home from work one day and went into the bathroom. I saw something strange. A wooden board which had covered a hole in the ceiling that led to a small attic space lay fractured in 2 pieces on the ground. I examined the pieces. The board was an inch thick, and it would have taken Bruce Lee to break it. I thought the landlord had sent someone to work on the attic. I was frozen stiff with fear. Someone is up there for sure, I thought. I emailed pictures to the landlord, asking if anyone had been there, with an undertone of annoyance since she hadn't warned me. Her reply read, "Please call me as soon as you are able to." I called, and she explained that her last 2 tenants had said the same thing happened. She promised to replace the board, and she did. A month later, I woke up one night around 4 a.m. My body was covered in goosebumps. It felt like someone was rubbing his or her hands on me. Everything was silent, but then I heard a dragging sound coming from above my bed. It was as if someone was pulling a sack of potatoes. I froze, convinced someone was up there. There is no way an animal could make that sound. After 5 minutes, I worked up the courage to turn on the light, armed myself with a cricket bat, and walked to the bathroom. That's when I saw that the new board covering the hole was broken in 2. I felt sick. The dragging sound had stopped. But I heard something else. Whispering. The sound was clear and coming from the attic. It sounded like children's voices, and I could hear one sentence repeated over and over. "It's your turn. It's your turn." I switched on every light in the apartment to make things feel normal. It was 5 a.m. and dark outside. I watched TV to try to unwind. Then a fuse blew. My pet budgie, Dexter, whom I kept in the kitchen, usually never made a sound at night, but he started squawking like he was being strangled. I'd never heard him make those sorts of noises. He was screaming. I grabbed my car keys, ran out, sat in my car, and waited there until the sun came up. When I saw people walking their dogs, this comforted me enough to go back in. The front door was open, but I figured I might have forgotten to close it when I ran out. I went to the kitchen to check on Dexter, but he wasn't in his cage. I felt sick again. All my windows were closed, so I looked everywhere inside. When I walked to the bathroom, I heard splashing. Dexter was half drowned in the toilet. I took him out, washed him, and dried him. I was so confused. At 8 a.m., I called the landlord and gave her a watered-down version of the night. "Oh, wow, you heard the whispering too," she said. I stayed in that apartment for another 18 months. I heard the whispering on a few occasions, and twice the board covering the hole in the ceiling moved. Although I live elsewhere now, the landlord recently called. She said that her new tenants had begged to speak with me about some of the stuff that's been going on there. Forget it. It's their problem now. The ambulance company that I used to work for had a haunted ambulance, Rig 12, recounts reddit.com user Zerbo. A lot of EMTs had stories about it, but I never put much stock in paranormal stuff. That is, until I had my own experience with Rig 12. My partner and I were working in a rural community at 3 a.m., and it was pitch dark and completely quiet. We were both dozing. I was in the driver's seat, and she was in the passenger seat. I woke up to a muffled voice, but I thought my partner was talking. I told her I was trying to sleep and close my eyes. I distinctly heard a male voice say, "Oh my God, am I dying?" followed by a few seconds of heavy breathing. My partner and I sat up straight and looked back into the patient compartment, where it sounded like the voice had come from. Things were quiet for a couple of seconds. Then we heard the click of an oxygen bottle regulator and a hiss as if it was leaking. I turned on the lights and we ran out of the rig. I thought a transient might have climbed in while we were asleep, so we opened the rear doors. No one was there. I checked the oxygen bottles. Neither was opened. We didn't sleep much after that. I've never lived in a haunted house, but my mother did as a teen.
Other houses on her street had strange things going on too. A few homes away from her lived a family. One night the daughter went to bed with a bad headache. The next day she was dead and she'd passed away from an aneurysm.
After her funeral, the family went away to get their minds off the tragedy, and the father asked my uncle, my mum's brother, to check on their pets. My mum and dad, who were dating at the time, went with him. My mother had heard there was a grand piano, and she wanted to play it. My dad was studying to be a veterinarian. After entering the house, my uncle and my father headed to the basement to see the animals, and my mother went to the piano on the ground floor. She was playing it when she felt something brush her ankles. She thought a cat must have left the basement and walked past her. She kept playing, and then she felt it again. She looked under the piano and saw nothing. When she started again, she felt hands clasp her legs tightly. She dashed to the basement door, called my uncle and father, and waited for them. Back outside, my uncle could tell my mum was rattled and asked what was wrong. She told him what had happened, and he turned white. He told her the daughter who had died used to play a game with her father. When he played the piano, she'd crawl underneath, grab his ankles and push his feet up and down on the pedals. Throughout Latin America, you'll hear variations of the story of La Llorona, or the Wailing Woman. Sometimes she's lost her husband, sometimes she's lost her children, sometimes it's both. But in La Pava, a ski spot in the Chilean Andes, the Wailing Woman is named Lola, and everyone in the area swears they knew her before she died. A local restaurant owner said he dated her, pro skier Drew Tabke says, adding that the ski patroller he heard the story from pointed at the exact hut where this tale takes place. The story starts on a nice day in peak ski season. Lola and her young son plan to spend the day on the slopes. As can happen in the Andes, a thick fog rose up from the valley, which often precedes the arrival of a real storm. The clouds enveloped the two as they were making their way down from the top of the mountain, and they lost contact with one another. Tabke says, desperate to find her son, Lola began screaming his name as she ran through the thick fog. Unable to see clearly, though, she stumbled down a steep slope and began sliding toward a rocky couloir. By chance, a local lift operator who was returning to his cabin came across her body. He was afraid she was dead, but on closer inspection, he found she was still alive, just barely, Tabke says. Her body was covered in lacerations from sharp rocks, and the only word she said, in the faintest whisper, was her son's name. The lift operator worked to carefully pull her body to his cabin, which was just up the hill. He bandaged her cuts as best he could and then ran to fetch the doctor. Together, the doctor and lift operator made their way back to his hut, the fog hanging thickly in the air. When they arrived, though, the bed was empty. Just the bloody sheets remained. Neither the woman nor her son were ever found, Tabke says, but locals report hearing her wail for her child whenever they're near that lift operator's cabin. And here's the thing, Tabke does not believe in ghosts. Something, however, changes when he arrives in Chile each winter. Maybe it's the fact that from La Parva you can see up to Cerro El Plomo, an Incan child sacrifice site. Maybe it's because Tabke has simply read so many magical realism books by authors like Juan Rulfo and Gabriel Garcia Marquez. But sitting alone in his cabin in the Andes, with the wind whipping and the candles flickering, he swears that every now and then he just can't tell if what he's hearing is a woman or the wind. When Brad Culp was a student at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, there was a rumor that the town was one of the most haunted places in America. When Culp started an on-campus magazine, he couldn't wait to write about several of the area's most famous phantoms. Not long after his story published, though, he kept finding himself thinking about one ghost in particular, the ghost of Oxford Milford Road. As the story goes, many decades ago, probably sometime in the 1940s, there was a young man courting a young woman in a rural part of town. Because the woman's parents didn't approve of the match, each night he visited under the cover of darkness. After her parents went to bed, the young woman would sneak out of her farmhouse and flash the lights of her parents' car 3 times. Then her young suitor would ride his motorcycle down the road. One night, he took the turn right before her house, a little too sharp, says Culp. The motorcycle went one way, he went the other. His injuries were so severe that he did not survive. Rumor has it, however, that his love-struck ghost still haunts this stretch of Milford Road. Curious Culp, his girlfriend, now his wife, and a friend decided to head out there one night to see if they could verify the tale. His girlfriend was worried she'd be completely freaked out. She believes more in that stuff than I do, Culp says, but he was mostly concerned that his suspicions that none of this was actually true would be confirmed. On this particular night, as Culp passed the abandoned farm, an idea came to him, and he pitched it to his girlfriend. How could she not say yes? Though reluctant, she relented, and Culp turned a short way into the farmhouse driveway. He killed the enginey and flashed his lights 3 times. No joke, there was a single headlight that appeared 3/4 of a mile down the road, Culp says. You saw it start to come, going pretty slow. It kept coming and coming. My wife was freaking out. It was coming closer and closer. As a collision seemed imminent, Culp turned on his car's lights. He expected to see a kid on a bike, bailing out from his prank now that he'd been caught. But there's nothing there. The light is just gone, he says. They got out of the car. They walked around trying to figure out what it was they could have seen. To this day, we still talk about it. I saw something I cannot explain, he says. If you get him and his wife around a campfire, they'll swear up and down that the story is true. And if you're ever in Oxford, Ohio, consider parking for just a few minutes on Oxford-Milford Road at night to test your own nerve. I was jolted awake about an hour ago, confused and disoriented. My heart was pounding and my sheets were soaked in sweat. Some slavering, malevolent horror was in the trailer with me, creeping up on me while I slept with poised claws and razor teeth. The absolute certainty of this coated my mouth with the metallic taste of fear, sour and dry and thick. I grabbed the baseball bat that lays beneath my cot and tiptoed around the cramped darkness of my trailer, straining to hear over the keening of the wind outside and the pounding of my own heart. Of course, there was nothing here except my goldfish and yours truly, the sweaty guy in his underwear. It was the gusting wind that startled me awake. It happens quite often in the late autumn and early winter. The wind rips through the scrub of skeletal trees that surround the trailer park and charges, with a lion's roar, into our lonely huddle of frail little shelters. It gibbers and shrieks and pounds on our walls with fists of dead leaves and frozen grit. Satisfied that I wasn't about to become chow for some unspeakable creature, I laid back down on my squeaky, saggy old cot and tried to get back to sleep, but I couldn't. Instead, I found myself thinking about that night in the penitentiary, the night of the lockdown. I kept thinking about Mikey and Big Rob and the rest of them, all of us huddled in a cell with the lights off, and the frigid northwest winds howling at the walls. After a while, I gave up trying to sleep. Instead, I sat down in front of the computer and I started typing. I'm no storyteller, not like Mikey or Hutch, but I'll try my best. When I first came to the pen, the thing that struck me the most about the place was just how much the cons talk. On the occasions when I'd served time in the county jail, there had been talk, sure, but it was terse and impersonal. When they're only serving a few months, I guess a lot of people feel the situation is too temporary to bother forging any ties with their fellow inmates. You'd play cards with your telly, or you'd sit in the day room and watch TV in relative silence. The only time that there would ever be any noise or action was when a scrap broke out over a card game. Fights were the only thing that passed as excitement in county. Every other moment of the day was comprised of dull, boring nothing. Going in, you just hoped that the food wouldn't be too bad, and that your cellie wouldn't end up being a gang member or a meth-head biker waiting out a long patch of dead time. People, in other words, who might beat the shit out of you as a way to pass the hours. The pen, though, it's an incredibly noisy, smelly, vocal environment. I remember very clearly the moment when my little group of new arrivals were let out of the fish tank and into our new home, a pod housing 200 inmates. I was overwhelmed by the deafening din of voices and activity when the hacks marched us, bundles in hand, out onto the range. Of course, there were the obligatory catcalls and wolf whistling, but most of the cons seemed completely oblivious to us. They were too busy living the ebb and flow of penitentiary life. Of course, this was not actually true. Cons see everything, and I mean everything, but they talk even more. My first cellie wanted both my bail and my arse, in that order. That wasn't happening. I hammered him in the mouth and it was on. The fight spilled out of the cell and into the corridor of the pod. He was a big, tough old bull, but I had him leaking and his confidence was shaken. Before the COs got to us, I'd managed to get the nasty old fuck face down onto the floor and was whamming away on the back of his head and neck like a jackhammer Then the hacks got there, and one of them laid a size 12 boot upside my skull. The kick knocked my brain clear over the moon. The world immediately went out of focus, and it stayed that way for almost 12 hours. I spent the next 3 weeks in the hole for fighting, and when I got out, I was placed in a different pod. Word had got around that this fish wasn't exactly new, and that I had a mean right cross. No one bothered to try and roll up on me in the yard that day, and when I sat down at chow with my new cellie and some of his boys, no one objected. I had been checked, and I'd passed the test. I wasn't a punk or a sissy. I could sit with the men. Yeah, it's a different world, the pen is, and it has wildly different rules. You couldn't fully understand unless you've been there. It wasn't long before I settled into a routine. Up for head count and chow, off to work in the laundry, chow, nap, work out, chow. And then the struggle to fill the dead hours between supper and lights out. There wasn't much to do. The cons played cards, betting with tobacco bales purchased from the commissary and individual hand-rolled smokes. Some watched TV, and others watched the wall. Some watched each other. Tensions were always high between the rival gangs. Dope fiends spiked what they liked to spike in the bathrooms. Daddies took their sugar boys into rented cells or the showers, and they got some ass pussy while a homeboy held watch for the cops. And there was, of course, a lot of talk of family back home, women had and lost, of misdeeds proudly done. There were enough stories flying around that place to fill a library. My cellie was an old con named Mikey. He had originally been sentenced to 15 years for second-degree murder during a robbery, but he had gotten into so much trouble since landing in the pen that he'd managed to acquire an additional 10 years on top of that. Mikey was doing all day, and he'd made peace with that fact. A good cat, all in all. A straight shooter who didn't fuck with the spike. The thing was, he killed just about anyone if he got it into his head that he wanted to. In earlier years, Mikey had been a triggerman for the bikers. He'd been convicted for the murders of 6 people and was a suspect in 16 others. And I can well imagine that a number of them had probably been friends of his at one point or another. In certain circles, a good friend can become your murderer in the blink of an eye. That's the kind of people you do time with in maximum security. Mikey and his crew liked nothing better than to spend a Sunday evening crowded up in someone's cell, drinking Pruno and shooting the shit. Personally, I didn't care much for the hooch. It tasted like rotting garbage with a heavy fruit bouquet, but the stories were welcome. When Mikey or one of his homeboys were on a roll, we could all forget ourselves and be somewhere else for a little while. As far as cons go, they were good fucking guys, and these bull sessions were the glue that held Mikey's crew together. I remember watching and listening for hours on end, spellbound, as Mikey or Big Rob or whoever wove a tapestry of words in the thin air around us. They'd make us roar with laughter, clench in rage, and even silently choke up in sadness. Some of those guys could play a man's emotions like a violin with their storytelling. They were masters of the form. Most of the time the stories were pretty coarse, which was to be expected. Look where they were coming from. And occasionally, they were downright fucking horrifying. But there's one in particular that I can remember word for word, quite literally. I can actually close my eyes and see Mikey and Rob Hutch and the rest of them sitting there in the cell that night, all of us bathed in the sickly red glow of the emergency lights and transfixed by what we were being told. This particular story likes to pop up in my head in the small, dead hours of the night, when the harsh winds of drab old November lash and rock my rusty little trailer hard enough to wake me up, as they did tonight. Coincidentally, it was on a November night just like this when I heard this story. I was about a year into my 4-year sentence for armed robbery, and this was my second winter in the pen. I recall that the goddamned wind was cutting through the walls really badly that night, and the drafts were freezing our toes solid. There had been a murder that day, and the whole pen was on lockdown, all 5 pods, and the protective custody unit too. Big Rob Hutch was a man who had his ear to the ground, and he had known that the lockdown was imminent. We had just enough time to make preparations for what was coming. Happy for a chance to hang out and get fucked up, 7 of us quickly herded into his cell with our bedding, snacks from the commissary, and as much gear as we could get our hands on. I remember that we were all wrapped up in our thin, scratchy blankets like convict burritos. The blankets were grey and made of rough wool, Upon checking into the Razor Wire Inn, you were issued one and one only. In the winter, blankets were at a premium. Men would fight for them, sometimes even kill for them. Mikey and Big Rob were both sitting on the lower bunk. Coltrane and his kid Remy had the top one. I was freezing my ass on the floor, along with Nick and Richie. The young pups had to sit on the floor. That's just the way it was. The old cons got to snuggle their asses into the relative comfort of the thin mattresses that covered the squeaky spring slats, and in Coltrane's case, the old con's bitch as well. We weren't complaining out loud about it, though. We knew better than to do that. Big Rob was a trustee, and one of his duties was to mop the floors in the prison morgue. He was telling us what had happened when the coroner performed his autopsy on Stutters. Stutters was a junkie who had been suspected of ratting out various other cons to the cops in exchange for smack. He was the reason why the entire pen was on lockdown. He had been discovered in his bunk after lunch, dead as day-old dogshit and full of ragged holes. The shiv was found in a toilet in the shower room. It had been made from plastic bags, heated to melting with a bic, then compressed to form a sturdy, sharp little weapon. So I'm mopping up by where they keep the gurneys, and down the hall the doors open a bit, so I can see the doc leaning over Stutters on the table. He's humming and singing to himself like usual, and I'm smiling at how shitty his voice is, when all of a sudden the doc says, "Holy shit, would you look at that?" And then he starts gagging and retching. Then, get this, then he actually screams. For real, he fucking screamed, and he yells, "Jesus Christ, it's all over my fucking arm." He runs out of the room and down the other hall, and I'm like, what the fuck is that all about? I heard him yelling for his assistants, or whatever they are, the younger ones. They all come running back, and I heard one of the assistants say, "Oh fuck, you gotta be kidding me." Then the smell hits me, from all the way down that long-ass hallway, and it's putrid, boys. It smelled like a combination of rotting flesh and an old shithouse in August. I had to grab my nose and run the fuck out of there. Worst thing I ever smelled. Nick asked, "What was it from?" and shifted uncomfortably where he sat beside the toilet. He was a good bit younger than me. He'd just celebrated his 20th birthday a few months ago. It was his first time in, and he'd drawn the fucking short straw. 15 years, 8 before he'd be considered for parole. His uncle, fortunately for Nick, was also serving time in the same facility. He was an upper echelon Hell's Angel who ruled both B-Pod and C-Pod with an iron fist. As a result, Nick was getting the easiest ride a first-timer to the pen ever had. Coltrane and Mikey had personally welcomed the kid into the crew, as per the old man's orders. He was fresh-faced and physically soft. I occasionally wonder if he'd ever really known just how bad it could have been for him in there. Apparently, Big Rob said, lowering his voice to a husky stage whisper, Stutters was getting checked for pokes and track marks pretty regular because he got busted so much for possession, so he started shooting in his arse. But not like in his arse cheek, you dig. I mean right into the wall of his rectum. He was shooting it right inside his fucking asshole, man. Can you imagine that? Pretty soon, he developed a fucking horrible abscess because of all the fecal bacteria and crap that was living up his old dirt road. The abscess got infected real bad. After a while, it skinned over with a crust of white blood cells and gross stuff and ballooned out into a giant puss bubble. That bubble got so big that it eventually closed up the poor fucker's ass, and I mean right fucking shut. He was apparently going around like that for weeks, man, for real. Weeks. It must have hurt like a bitch. So, the doc saw something kinda bubbling out of the dead fucker's asshole, and he prodded at it with his scalpel, and pop! Out gushes a metric fuckload of bloody green pus, full of dead bacteria and stinking like the devil's ballsack. Oh fuck, that's just dirty, man, Mikey groaned, and mimed throwing up all over Hutch. We were all wrinkling our noses in disgust and shaking our heads. Dirty was not nearly adequate for this disgusting image. That ain't it though, my friend. That ain't it. The worst part, he continued, was the fact that Stutters had been bunged up with this fucking pus balloon for a few weeks or so, you know? It stopped up his shit canal. When the doc popped that thing with his scalpel, oh, hell, it was a literal shitstorm. It spurted out of his ass like a high-pressure hose. We regarded that image for a moment or two in stunned silence. I felt a bit ill. So, fucking dirty, Mikey roared, and despite what I'd just heard, I had to laugh. Coltrane and the others joined in. Remy just looked disgusted. He was filing his nails. Remy was no longer just another cell block punk, a weaker man that traded what he had to trade in order to get by in a world dominated by strength. In recent months, he'd gone and went full-blown sissy. After a year or so of enduring the subservient female role at the receiving end of Coltrane's hogleg, Coltrane was, in fact, the one who'd turned Remy out in the first place, he'd finally stopped playing the part of a woman and was now living it. It was apparent that he'd started taking illicit female hormones, his arm hair had thinned out, and it seemed that he had recently grown the barest suggestion of breasts beneath his orange jumpsuit. By the time I got out of the pen, Remy had changed his name to Rian and was the wife of, get ready for this, none other than Nick's uncle, the unofficial king of pods B and C. Rian was known for causing savage fights amongst inmates who were vying for his attention. That, incidentally, was exactly how Coltrane ending up earning an unexpected early parole. A backdoor parole, as they call it, because you don't leave through the front gate when you're dead. So the doc got shit on by a corpse, said Richie, in a slow and dreamy tone. It was pus-covered shit. That's fucked up, man. Hey, do you think that happens a lot to him? Or was that the first time? Richie had snorted some hydromorphone earlier, and now he was somewhere in the clouds, floating around with a stoned grin on his face. Richie, that's just fucking, Mikey trailed off. Actually, it's a good question. Want some hooch, boys? I was just opening my mouth to say, fuck no, and then there was a pop and everything was dark. The cons began yelling and hooting all across the pod, both tiers on both sides. Big Rob yelled, "Shut up, you fucking idiots! It's just a blackout, for Christ's sake, pipe the fuck down." And, for a wonder, some of them actually did. The thing was, Big Rob Hutch was, well, just that. Big. He was as big as a buffalo. I was surprised that the lower bunk could support both Rob and Mikey, who was not exactly small himself. The emergency lights snapped on, soft and red and eerie. It made the common area of C-Pod look like a scene from an apocalyptic horror movie. We could see the guard standing there in the guard hut through the bulletproof glass, waiting to see how the cons were going to react to the power going out during a lockdown. Now, not only were we being sequestered in our cramped little cells for an indeterminable length of time, we had also been rendered unable to properly read a book. A number of the cons could actually read and did, or see your hand while playing cards, or even listen to the radio, for Christ's sake. The hack was a dark figure, swathed in dim red, his body language alert and poised for action. I'm pretty sure it was Robson who was the boss on hut duty that night. Robson was a dead-eyed, square-jawed oaf without an ounce of empathy in his whole body. And he just so happened to have a 12-gauge shotgun on hand with a modified choke. I fervently hoped that no one would take it into their heads to start some serious shit. Because if they did, there was a good chance we'd all regret it. There was a lot of hollering and door-kicking around the pod, but it soon became apparent that the ruckus was just for show and was half-hearted at best. We all silently thanked whoever might be listening that the emergency reaction team wasn't going to be called in. The ERT didn't fuck around. Kevlar suited and anonymous in their visored helmets. They'd march into the pod and indiscriminately barge into cell after cell, busting heads and whapping out teeth with their batons. Hell, you might even get shot, and the ERT shoot to kill. Richie broke the silence. Man, I was getting real worried there for a minute. If the fucking goon squad busted in here and found all our shit, we'd be dicked. Richie was doing 6 years for selling pills. The sentence for a second-time loser, oxycontin, and hydrocodone were his chemicals of choice. Faced with the boredom of prison life, he'd started using the products he sold. He was a straight-up junkie by Christmas of that year. Mikey didn't care about anyone using junk, would even have a little snort here and there himself, but he didn't like addicts, not one bit. He cut Richie out of the crew, addled by junk, plagued by debt, weak and alone. Richie ended up bunking with some fellas from the top tier, across from us, the black tier. In a maximum security penitentiary, this has unpleasant connotations. Business might occur between the color lines, but that's generally where any benign fraternization ends. You might not be racist when you're on the outside, but when you're inside, you don't have much choice. To be blunt, it's like this. If you're white, you stick with the whites. The black and Hispanic cons, don't want to be your buddy, and vice versa. There are, for a variety of reasons, a large number of hostilities between the color lines. They'll stomp the shit out of you, or worse. When we got word that Richie had been seen walking, his face cast down, up the stairs to that second tier, well, we knew Richie had heavy debts. Forced to either trade himself or die, Richie had chosen life. Jesus, I felt horrible for how it ended for Richie, I still do. His desperate last bid to cling to his wretched mortal existence only prolonged the inevitable. He was dead within a month. One day, after enduring his morning gang rape, something must have finally snapped in Richie's head. His will to live crumbled and fell. Richie stayed behind while his tormentors went down for morning chow, and he stuck a spike in his arm for the last time. High as a kite, Richie then hung himself from the corner post of the top bunk. He did it with a rope made of knotted together socks. I'm rambling now, aren't I? Sorry, I do that sometimes. You'll just have to bear with me, I guess. I'm not a good at this, not like Mikey or Hutch. I'm just a lonely guy who can't sleep some nights, when the shrieking wind could be mistaken for the wailing of lost souls, shaking and rattling the windows in their frames. Even though I was released from the pen 15 years ago, I can't shake the feeling that I'm somehow still inside. But I suppose that we're all imprisoned by something on some level, aren't we? On nights like tonight, my prison is this rusty trailer. It's my pathetic, menial job, my divorce, my raw, red-eyed fury, unfocused and impotent. It's sorrow and regret. On nights like tonight, my prison is the past and my inability to leave it behind. So there we all were, sitting there in the weird, red gloom and listening to all the yelling and bullshit slowly die down. Richie abruptly went on the nod. Nick balanced a shoe on his head. We all chuckled. Coltrane started talking about the hockey game that was about to start, then abruptly shut up. We were on lockdown with no electricity. There would be no hockey game that night, not for us. We passed a J around, and when that one was roached, we passed another. Finally, Mikey spoke up and broke the silence. So, who's up for some Twilight Zone shit tonight? I got a good one for you. You remember the last time the power went out, Hutch? Hutch shot him a dark look, then did something very unusual for a hardened con. He shuddered. You want to tell the boys that story? I don't know, man. Why not? Fuck, the lights are out and the winds are howling out there. Perfect time for it. Okay, fuck it, let's do it. Big Rob cleared his throat and said, okay, boys, it's time for a scary story. Crowd around the fucking campfire and grab a cup of this fine wine. It's more of a brandy, I think, Hutch. Mikey grinned and offered me some. Reluctantly, I accepted a styrofoam cup of the murky, eye-watering stuff and steeled myself to swallow it. I was feeling a bit happier now. I've always been a fan of spooky stories. His voice stern, Mikey growled, okay, first things first, this shit is 100% true, got it? We're not bullshitting about any of this, for real. So don't tell us that we're full of shit, or you can go have a fucking sleepover with that asshole over in the hack shack. Got it, Richie grunted, then flopped over onto the floor. He was out of it. This all went down a long time ago, before any of you were here. At least 12 years, I'd say. Mikey? Yeah, for sure, at least that long. Back when these little punks were still giving out handjobs in juvie, huh? It was a while back anyways. Me and Mikey here were both running with different crews back then, into different shit, but we knew each other. I guess I would have been about your age, he said, pointing down at me. So one day the fish tank had just been emptied out into the pod, and there's a new fish with them that immediately starts turning heads. I was playing checkers on the tier upstairs when they all came walking through the gate, looking like a bunch of lost little lambs down there on the range. They came toddling in behind a couple of the hacks, and at the end of the line is the prettiest little sweet boy this whole penitentiary has ever seen. I don't play no grab-ass like Coltrane up there, but this kid, he was, I don't know, almost like an angel or something. He was too perfect, like a picture out of a magazine, you know, slender and fair-haired, teeny-bopper heartthrob material. Yeah, the kid was pretty all right, and he looked like he'd be easy to punk. Big Rob took a moment to pause and force back a swig of the awful, cloying Pruno, a noxious blend of fermented fruit, sugar packets, and yeast. As he grimly swallowed it down, Mikey jumped in and continued the story. The new fish immediately drove the whole pod completely fucking nuts. The wolves were losing their minds for real. The guards were looking worried. A pretty kid like that can cause a lot of hard feelings between the bulls. Hard feelings usually turn into murder, so they released the other fishies to the care of the boss at the guard hut, then hustled the pretty boy off to protective custody post-fucking-haste. They kept him there for a few days, but the wolves didn't forget about him, not for a moment. All the time they're asking about the kid to the trustees who had access to PC. They're asking if the kid's lonely, if he wants a candy bar, or a fuck book, or a baggie of fucking horse, whatever the kid might possibly want. They're handing the trustees love notes to give to him, money, weed, all kinds of shit. Finally, a con named Holbrook called in some heavy favors, and the hacks moved the kid back into the pod, more to the point, into Holbrook's cell. I remember watching as the hacks walked the young fella across the pod and up the stairs to his new home. The kid had no expression in those wide blue eyes, none at all, just blank. Holbrook was a big, greasy son of a bitch, real nasty. You could smell him from 20 feet away. Complete psycho, that guy. Man, I'll tell you, watching as Brookie grinned and waited at the door of his cell for his new little bunk buddy to arrive, hell, it made me feel sorry for the kid. He was planning to do bad things to the boy, you could see it in that grin. He was gonna hurt him. No expression at all, though, on that kid's face. I remember thinking that the fishy was either brave as fuck or just too stupid to understand what was in store for him. Rob tossed back the rest of the hooch in his Dixie cup and tried not to gag. Gah, this shit is just fucking awful. Who brewed this? His voice sounded dry and burnt. Our fine neighbors just down the hall, that's who, Mikey chuckled. They managed to hide it in the toilet tank long enough to get her finished, and holy Jesus, ain't it nasty? Fuck, I think I'm going blind already. Hutch held out his cup and Mikey poured him another glurt out of the plastic bag, taking care to make sure that the sock he was using as a filter didn't slip out and spill rotting fruit cocktail all over the bunk. I tried a sip of mine and almost retched. They all had a good hardy-har at this, except for Richie, I guess. Richie was still laying on the floor, his eyelids fluttering and twitching. It broke more than a few hearts to see Holbrook get his dirty hooks into the kid first. He would wreck the kid's asshole and destroy his soul, that was the general consensus. Come morning, they'd be rolling the kid out to the infirmary and afterward probably stick him back into PC for a 24-hour suicide watch. Even if he did come back to the pod again, no one would want the kid, not after the permanent damage that Brookie was liable to do to him. See how lucky you are, Coltrane said to Remy, and the little Frenchman smiled down at his nails in response, then kept filing them delicately with all of his concentration. Every now and then, I wonder if Remy was already planning the flirtations and indiscretions that would inevitably result in Coltrane's murder, his skull smashed in with a 20-pound dumbbell in the weight pit. Coltrane, the bull queer, who had taken Remy's manhood and eventually transformed him into something that he'd probably never wanted to be. Thinking about it now, I'm pretty sure he was. And I can't blame him for it. Rob told us, I heard screaming that night. It was muffled, but I could still hear it. So did Marcelli. Back then, it was old Johnny Franzini. I whispered up at him, "Hey, you hear that shit, man? Fuck, that's awful." And he answered, real matter of fact, "That boy, he had to know it was coming, hey? He's too pretty like a girl to be here in this place. He should have never come here." As if the guy had fucking volunteered or something, I just shook my head and told Johnny to go to sleep. I felt so bad for the kid, you know. I think that was one of the worst nights I ever had in here. I heard it too, Mikey interjected. I think we all did, including the bosses on duty that night. But no one went to check on him, 'cause money makes the fucking rules around here, not the warden or the government. It's money. I don't doubt that the sick fuck offered big coin for the kid, and some cold son of a bitch sold him without a second thought. Hutch nodded sourly. Money's a whore. That's okay though, 'cause there's a thing called karma too. When morning came, lo and behold, Brookie ain't standing outside his cell, waiting to be accounted for. Neither is the kid. A whisper popped up real quick and spread down the lines like the breeze, and it said, "Holbrook went apeshit on the kid last night and killed him. He's waiting in his cage for the ERT to come in and bust his head." The boss doing the head count paused at Holbrook's cell, and every con craned his head to see what was going to happen next. All of us in unison. I seen the hack pull out his radio with one hand and his club with the other. He started talking real fast into his radio. At the same time, he's slowly walking towards the door of Brookie's cell with his club poised to bash a skull in. like he's trying to ward someone off. He started yelling for the other hacks to get the fuck over there, pronto. They all came thundering past, with their keys jangling and their boots clomping, and then we all got ordered to step back into our cells with empty bellies. I heard 'em down there at Brookie's cell, yelling into their radios and stomping around, and then I heard someone barf. I heard the puke splatter on the tiles.
We had to stay in our cells for a few hours, and there was a lot of bitching. I remember being completely pissed at Holbrook. Me and Johnny F. We'd assumed that he'd gone psycho on the new fish and cut the kid's throat while he was fucking him, or some shit like that. But then some of the emergency response guys came past wheeling a gurney, and when they wheeled it past us again, you could knock me flat with a pea shooter, because it was Holbrook strapped in there, not the kid. I only saw him for a few seconds, but I remember that his face was fucked. It was mostly gone, stripped right down to bloody sinew and bones. No skin or muscles left. It was fucking gruesome. I kinda gasped out loud, and even close-mouthed, crooked-nosed old Johnny Franzini had to look twice and say, "Hey, what the fuck?" The only way I knew it was him was the hair. A big, greasy mop of it like a caveman. The sheet covering the body was soaked right through with his blood. I think that the rest of him had matched his face.
Nick whistled and said, "Fuck, man, that's hardcore," then sparked another joint. We floor dwellers had almost forgotten about the discomfort of our numb behinds and tingling feet. We'd forgotten the lockdown and the power outage, and even poor Stutters, who'd not only died a violent death, but had also died with his ass blocked up by a cystic sore the size of a man's fist. Mikey and Hutch were telling a story, and we were living it. You know what I mean, we were right there. Mikey said, "Must have been 5 minutes later, the cops are rolling this crazy-looking thing down the block," and I'm like, "What the fuck is that?" to my cellie. But he don't know either. Before too long, they roll it past again, and I'm like, "Oh shit, look at this. You ever see Silence of the Lambs? The dolly cart thing that they strap Anthony Hopkins into when they're moving him? Yeah, that's exactly what it was, and they've got the kid strapped into it. Bite mask and everything, and the kid is just soaked in blood, man. It was dripping off his clothes, and I could hear it pattering on the floor behind him. It left a trail on the floor. They let us out for breakfast about a half hour after that, but by then it was almost lunch, and we got served a fucked-up mix of warm lunch and cold breakfast. There was more talking going on than eating, though, and everyone was saying the same thing. We were all saying, "What the fuck did the kid do to him?" Most people thought that he must have gotten hold of Brookie's shiv somehow, then sliced the fucker's shit right off, whittled him right down to the bone. But Brookie was a really big dude, and the guy was a crazy motherfucker. How a skinny little bitch like that could have overpowered a bad dude like Holbrook so easy? Well, we didn't know. The joint travelled across the floor folk and was then handed up to the bunks. Mikey hit it hard and made that funny choking noise that older guys sometimes do when holding in a big toke, nasal and strangled. He gave Nicky the thumbs up and blasted out smoke like a grizzled old dragon. "Shit's pretty good, Nicky. Good score. Gotta get some more of that." So, yeah, the kid, he got rolled off to the hole on his fucking Hannibal Lecter dolly, and they had him on a super tight lockdown. Nobody even catches a glimpse of him. They had the kid on a 24-hour watch, and the whole works. A couple trustees tried asking the hacks what happened with him and Brookie, and they got told to mind their own business and mop the fucking floors. The kid was in the hole for a week, then 2, then a month. All the while, ain't no one heard a peep about him getting charged with murder. There was a rumor going around that the coroner said in his report that Holbrook had died from a heart attack. Maybe his heart seizing up was the thing that actually killed him, sure. But there wasn't any mention of the way he'd been carved up, like a Sunday turkey. None at all. Mikey poured himself another round of refreshment, and the stink of the open bag made my eyes water. Hutch smiled a little, an action with no real humour behind it. Well, tongues were wagging, as they tend to do, and pretty soon people were saying that maybe the kid wasn't natural, that he did Brookie in with his teeth, that he ate the fucker alive, like some sort of monster. Guys were even saying that the priest paid him a visit in the hole and ended up leaving with tears in his eyes. Actually fucking crying and shit. Wouldn't say what happened, just that he didn't want to talk to the kid. Never again. He quit working here not long after that happened. Just up and quit, and I heard that the padre ended up selling his house and moving away. Like, across the country. Somewhere far, far away. Mikey's iron-grey beard split with a slight grin of his own. Now here's where shit gets really weird. Thank you for dropping by the archives and listening to our ghastly stories. Don't forget to like, comment, and lastly subscribe. Until next time, archivists, I bid you all good night.